Corporal James Wright had learned early in his military career that the key to surviving diplomatic escort duty was simple: stand still, look alert, and under no circumstances develop opinions about the people you're guarding. It was a philosophy that had served him well across a dozen planets and twice as many species. Then he met Princess Lyson, and his philosophy collapsed like a poorly constructed alibi. The Aurelian Palace didn't look built so much as cultivated, its walls growing in crystalline spirals that pulsed with soft azure light. The floors were smooth as polished glass but warm underfoot, and the air itself seemed to hum with a frequency that made James's teeth ache if he thought about it too long. Everything about the place screamed ancient civilization with technology you can't even spell, which was exactly why Earth's diplomatic corps had sent their best people to negotiate a trade agreement. James was not part of the best people. He was part of the stand in the corner and try not to embarrass humanity people, which suited him fine. The princess had appeared on his third day in the palace, gliding through the main hall with an entourage of courtiers who looked simultaneously bored and calculating. She was tall, all Aurelians were tall, with skin that held a silver-blue luminescence that shifted with her movements. Her ears rose in elegant curves from the sides of her head, their tips adorned with small crystalline ornaments that caught the light. She wore robes that seemed to be made from folded starlight, and when she passed James's position, she didn't so much as glance in his direction. He was relieved and, inexplicably, disappointed. Captain Torres, his commanding officer, had briefed the security team extensively on Aurelian customs. Don't make direct eye contact with royalty unless addressed. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch anything that glows, which in this palace meant don't touch approximately 90% of available surfaces. And absolutely, under no circumstances, attempt to initiate conversation with the princess. James was excellent at following orders. He stood his post, maintained his watch rotations, and kept his opinions to himself. It would have been fine if the princess had just been another face in a parade of dignitaries. But then he was assigned to her personal security detail. It happened on day 7, when one of the regular Aurelian guards fell ill with something the medics called luminescence flux and humans called space flu. James was pulled from corridor duty and told to accompany the princess on her evening walk through the palace gardens. He was given exactly 3 instructions: stay 10 paces behind, don't interrupt, and remember that Aurelian royalty valued silence over small talk. The gardens were somehow both inside and outside the palace simultaneously, existing in a transparent dome that showed the planet's 3 moons in perfect clarity. Bioluminescent plants grew in carefully tended beds, their leaves shimmering with the same quality of light he'd seen in the princess's skin. Water flowed in streams that seemed to ignore gravity, arcing through the air in impossible loops before cascading back to hidden reservoirs. The princess walked slowly, pausing occasionally to examine a flower or adjust the position of a stone. She spoke sometimes, but not to James, just observations aloud, as if testing thoughts by giving them voice. She mentioned a philosopher he'd never heard of, debated the merits of 2 different forms of stellar navigation, and at one point recited what sounded like poetry in a language his translator Chip couldn't parse. James stayed 10 paces back and tried not to think about how lonely she sounded. This became routine. Every evening, James would escort the princess through the gardens. Every evening, she would speak her thoughts to the air while he maintained his professional distance. He learned she was brilliant. That much was obvious. He learned she was fascinated by other cultures, that she'd studied 7 different languages, that she played a musical instrument that looked like a harp made of frozen light. He learned she hated formal dinners, loved ancient texts, and dreamed of traveling to worlds she'd only seen in Holovids. He learned she was profoundly, crushingly lonely. It showed in small ways. The way her luminescence dimmed slightly when courtiers approached with obviously calculated questions. The way she would pause mid-sentence during her garden musings, as if remembering no one was really listening. The way she held herself with perfect posture even when no one but a human guard was watching. Because being princess was apparently a full-time performance with no intermissions. James started to look forward to garden duty with an intensity that probably violated several of his earlier convictions about professional detachment. He told himself it was just pleasant to have regular duties, predictable schedules. He told himself the gardens were peaceful, a nice break from standing in corridors. He told himself he wasn't developing an absolutely catastrophic crush on an alien princess who was so far out of his league they weren't even playing the same sport. He was lying to himself, but he was very good at it. On the 17th evening, the princess stopped beside a flowering plant with petals that only opened under the light of all 3 moons. She stood there for a long moment, watching the petals unfurl in crystalline spirals, and then she spoke. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to choose your own path, to wake one morning and simply leave? Go anywhere, be anyone, without the weight of expectation following you like a shadow. James stayed quiet, maintaining his 10-pace distance. She wasn't talking to him. She never talked to him. I have read about human customs, the princess continued, her voice soft enough that he had to strain to hear over the sound of flowing water. About the concept of running away. It sounds both terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. To be unknown, to be ordinary. She touched one of the flower petals gently. I wonder if I would be brave enough if given the chance. She was quiet then, just breathing in the cool night air, while 3 moons cast triple shadows across the garden paths. James stood in his assigned position, watching her luminescence shift through shades of blue and silver, and felt something crack open in his chest. She wasn't a remote figure of alien royalty. She was a person trapped in a role she hadn't chosen, lonely in ways that transcended species and culture. And in that moment, James forgot every single directive about professional distance. He forgot he was standing close enough to the flowing water that its sound might cover his voice. He forgot that Aurelian hearing was documented as far more acute than human hearing. He forgot everything except the ache of watching someone brilliant and beautiful and desperately isolated wish for freedom she'd never have. I wish I could marry her, James whispered to himself, barely a breath of sound. The princess went absolutely still. James's brain caught up with his mouth approximately 3 seconds too late. Horror flooded through him cold and complete as he realized the water wasn't loud enough. The distance wasn't far enough, and he had just said something catastrophically stupid where an alien princess with superior hearing could definitely, absolutely, without question hear him. Princess Lyson turned slowly, and her eyes found him in the shadows with the precision of a targeting system. Her luminescence had flared bright. Surprise, he thought wildly, or maybe anger, or maybe the Aurelian equivalent of I'm about to have this idiot guard executed. Her expression was unreadable. James wanted to apologize, to explain, to throw himself on whatever mercy alien royalty might possess. His mouth opened. Nothing came out except a sound that might charitably be called a squeak. The princess stepped toward him, closing the careful 10-pace distance with 3 elegant strides. She stopped close enough that he could see the intricate patterns of light beneath her skin, the way they pulsed with something that looked almost like hope. Then my answer is yes, she said clearly, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning James couldn't begin to fathom. His brain tried several responses and settled on the deeply intelligent reply of, "What?" You spoke a binding proposal under the 3 moons of Aurelia, witnessed by the sacred gardens themselves. The princess's voice was steady, but her luminescence was cycling through colors faster than James could track. In our culture, such words cannot be taken back. They carry the weight of divine witness and personal truth. She paused, and something that might have been a smile touched her lips, and I have absolutely no desire to take them back. James felt the ground tilt sideways. I wasn't, that was just. He swallowed hard, Your Highness, I apologize, I didn't mean to. To speak the truth. She tilted her head, her elegant ears catching the moonlight. You believed yourself unheard. You gained nothing from those words except the satisfaction of speaking a private wish. That makes them more honest than anything anyone has said to me in years. But I can't, you can't. James gestured helplessly at himself, then at her, then at the general concept of reality. I'm a corporal, you're a princess. This is insane. Perhaps her luminescence settled into a steady gold. But it is also done. Tomorrow, the court will be informed of our betrothal. There will be trials, tests, and likely several attempts on your life from nobles who had other plans. But if you survive them, her smile widened slightly, we will be married under these same 3 moons in this same garden, where an honest man spoke an honest wish. She turned then, walking back toward the palace with the grace of someone who had just reshaped the political landscape and found it satisfying. At the entrance, she paused and looked back at James, who was still standing frozen beside the flowering plant. You should rest, Corporal Wright. Tomorrow will be very complicated. She disappeared into the palace, leaving James alone in the garden with 3 moons bearing witness, and the slowly dawning realization that his entire life had just been upended by his own treacherous mouth. Somewhere in the palace, bells began to chime, a sound his cultural briefings identified as announcements of major royal declarations. James listened to them echo through the crystalline halls and thought, with perfect clarity, that he was absolutely, completely, and irrevocably screwed. But underneath the panic, buried beneath the shock and disbelief, was a tiny seed of something that felt suspiciously like hope. Because Princess Lyson had said yes, not out of obligation or political maneuvering, but because she'd heard his honest wish and decided it was worth answering. James looked up at the 3 moons and whispered, much more quietly this time, "What have I done?" The moons, unhelpfully, just kept shining. James woke to someone sitting in his quarters, which violated approximately 17 military regulations and suggested his day was about to get significantly worse. He sat up fast, reaching for training that said identify threats before panic, and found Captain Maria Torres watching him with an expression that somehow combined disappointment, sympathy, and the particular exhaustion of someone whose subordinate has just become an interstellar incident. "Sir," James managed, his voice rough with sleep. "Right." Torres leaned back in the chair she'd pulled up beside his bunk. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to think very carefully before answering. Did you, or did you not, propose marriage to the crown princess of the Aurelian sovereignty last night in a sacred garden, under the light of 3 moons, using what their entire culture considers a binding religious oath?" James's mouth went dry. Yes, but I didn't mean to, it was an accident, I was just." "Save it." Torres held up a hand. "I've spent the last 3 hours in emergency meetings with the diplomatic corps, the Aurelian Royal Council, and approximately 40 advisors who all have different opinions about whether you're a romantic hero or a political disaster. The consensus, if you're curious, is that you're both." "Captain, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain how a trained military professional accidentally committed to a formal betrothal with alien royalty?" Tor's expression softened slightly. "Actually, knowing you, you probably can. You're not subtle, right? You've been looking at the princess like she hung the stars for 2 weeks." James felt heat rise in his face. "I kept my distance. I followed protocols." "You followed protocols right up until you whispered a marriage proposal within earshot of someone with hearing 3 times more acute than yours." Torres pulled out a datapad and began scrolling. "Here's the situation. The princess publicly accepted your proposal. She cited something called the doctrine of moonlit truth, which apparently makes your accidentally spoken proposal as legally binding as a signed contract. She informed her father, the emperor, at dawn. He's currently in consultation with his advisors about whether to have you quietly executed or publicly celebrated." "Which way is he leaning?" "Unknown." The Aurelians are big on tradition, and you accidentally followed their marriage proposal tradition perfectly. The problem is you're human, unranked nobility-wise, and approximately 7 social tiers below where a princess's consort should be. Tors set down the datapad. The good news is the princess was very clear that she wants this betrothal to proceed. She quoted poetry at the council, invoked 3 different historical precedents, and basically told them she's choosing you regardless of their opinions. James's head was spinning. Why would she do that? That, Tors said quietly, is a question you should probably ask her. But first, you need to understand what you're walking into. There's a faction led by someone called Lord Cassian, who had his own designs on marrying into the imperial line. He's not happy. There are also traditionalists who think a human consort weakens their bloodline, progressives who think this is a political stunt, and opportunists who are trying to figure out how to profit from the chaos. So everyone hates this. Not everyone. The younger courtiers seem to find it romantic. Earth's government is thrilled because this accidentally gave us more political leverage than 3 years of negotiations. And your mother somehow got a message through and left you a 45-minute voicemail that I'm legally obligated to make you listen to later. Tor stood. You have a meeting with a cultural advisor in an hour. They're going to explain the betrothal process, which apparently involves 17 stages and at least 3 situations where you could accidentally invalidate everything. Try not to do that. James dressed in his formal uniform, the one reserved for ceremonies and dignitaries, and followed an Aurelian attendant through corridors that felt more like walking through a dream than a building. Other guards watched him pass, some with curiosity, some with hostility, and one with what looked distinctly like pity. The cultural advisor was named Verum, an elderly Aurelian whose luminescence had faded to pale pearl. They gestured James to a seat in a chamber filled with holographic texts that floated like captured starlight. Corporal Wright. Verum's voice was dry with age but sharp with intelligence. You have created quite a situation. I really didn't mean to. Few do. The doctrine of moonlit truth exists precisely because the Aurelians believe the most honest words are those spoken without expectation of being heard. You spoke a wish believing yourself alone. The princess heard it. She chose to accept. By our laws, you are now formally betrothed. Can I apologize? Explain it was a mistake. You could, but the princess was quite clear in her acceptance. To retract now would be an insult that could collapse all diplomatic relations between our peoples and likely result in your execution. So I would advise against it. Verum pulled up a holographic display showing what looked like a flowchart designed by someone having a fever dream. This is the betrothal process for royal marriages. 17 stages, each with specific requirements and protocols. James stared at the display. That's comprehensive. The Aurelians value tradition. You will need to prove yourself worthy through trials of intellect, social grace, and character. You will be tested formally by the council and informally by those who wish to see you fail. Some of these tests will be public, some will be private. All will be designed to expose any unworthiness. Verum paused. I should also mention that Lord Cassian has already called for a trial of combat, which is his right as a high-ranking noble with concerns about the royal succession. Combat like actual fighting. Ritual combat, yes. Not to the death we're civilized, but certainly to the point of establishing dominance and capability. Cassian is one of our finest warriors. You are. Verum looked James up and down, human. That's not encouraging. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be accurate. The holographic display shifted to show a schedule. Your first trial is intellectual tomorrow before the Council of Scholars. The second is social, a formal banquet in 3 days. The combat trial will be scheduled after those, assuming you survive them. James rubbed his face. Is there any good news in this situation? Yes, the princess has chosen you. That suggests she sees something worth defending. Try not to make her regret it. The rest of the day was a blur of briefings, protocol lessons, and increasingly panicked messages from Earth asking him to please not destroy humanity's first major alien alliance. James absorbed what he could, forgot most of it immediately, and spent his free time wondering if he could just steal a shuttle and disappear into deep space. Evening came with a summons to dine with the princess. James was escorted to a private chamber he hadn't seen before, smaller than the grand halls but somehow more intimate. The walls were transparent, showing a view of the city below, towers of crystal and light stretching toward 3 moons rising in perfect synchronization. Princess Lyson was already there, dressed more simply than he'd seen her in court. No crown, no formal robes, just a fitted tunic and loose trousers that somehow made her look more regal rather than less. Her luminescence was a soft gold, pulsing gently with what his crash course in Aurelian body language suggested was calm anticipation. She gestured to a chair across from her. "Please, sit." James sat, acutely aware that he had no idea what he was doing. The table held food he didn't recognize, arranged with artistic precision that suggested each placement meant something. He picked up what he hoped was a fork and tried to remember which foods required which utensils from Varam's rapid-fire tutorial. "You're terrified," the princess observed. "I accidentally proposed marriage to an alien princess." Terrified seems proportionate. Her luminescence flickered with what he was learning meant amusement. "You did not accidentally feel what you felt, only accidentally spoke it aloud where I could hear." "That's fair." James set down the utensil. "Your Highness." "Lyson, if we are to be married, you should use my name. Lyson." The name felt strange and right on his tongue. "Why did you accept? You could have laughed it off, called it a cultural misunderstanding. You could have had me quietly removed from duty and forgotten this happened. Why bind yourself to a random—" James thought about this, about loneliness so profound that an overheard wish could feel like revelation. So this is real, not just political maneuvering. It is both and neither, and more than either of us intended. Lyson smiled, and it transformed her face from regal to radiant. "But yes, James, right. It is real. Now we must simply convince my father's court that you are not a complete disaster, survive several attempts to dissolve our betrothal, and avoid getting you killed by angry nobles." Simple enough. You have a concerning definition of simple. I have been trained since birth to navigate political complexity. This is merely another challenge. She poured something that steamed and smelled like citrus into 2 cups, sliding one toward him. "Tell me about Earth, about your life before you became accidentally engaged to me." They talked through dinner, the conversation flowing easier than James expected. He told her about growing up in Seattle, about joining the military because college was expensive and adventure sounded better than debt, about his family and friends and the ordinary life he'd left behind. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions that suggested she actually cared about the answers rather than just making conversation. In return, she told him about Aurelia, about palace life and the weight of expectations, about studies that felt like preparations for a role rather than exploration of interests. She spoke of texts she loved and philosophies that intrigued her, of dreams she kept private because princesses weren't supposed to dream of ordinary things. "I used to imagine," she said quietly, looking out at the 3 moons, "what it would be like to meet someone who saw me first and my title second. Someone who would speak to me honestly because they had no agenda, no political calculation. I imagined it so often that I convinced myself it was impossible." She looked back at him. "Then you whispered a wish in my garden." James felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like understanding. "I did mean it, you know, the wish. Even if I didn't intend to say it aloud, I meant it." "I know." Her luminescence brightened to warm gold. "That is why I accepted." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the moons rise higher and the city lights below shifting through colors James had no names for. Finally, Lyson stood. "You should rest." Tomorrow you face the council of scholars and they will not be gentle. But James, she paused at the doorway, thank you for being honest, for being here, for being brave enough to let an accidental wish become a deliberate choice. After she left, James sat alone in the chamber, looking at 3 moons and thinking about wishes and choices, and the strange paths that led people to exactly where they needed to be, even if they never planned on getting there. His datapad chimed with another message from Captain Torres. Don't screw this up. Also, your mother says she loves you and wants to know what kind of flowers Aurelians like. I have no idea how to answer that. James smiled despite himself, typed back a response about bioluminescent plants, and settled in to study for tomorrow's trial. He had accidentally proposed to an alien princess. She had inexplicably accepted, and now he had approximately 16 more stages to survive before this became official. But as he looked at his notes and thought about Lyson's smile, and the way her loneliness mirrored his own in unexpected ways, James found he didn't entirely regret his catastrophically honest whisper. Tomorrow would be complicated. But tonight, under 3 alien moons, he let himself believe that complicated might be worth it. The Council of Scholars consisted of 12 of the most intimidating people James had ever encountered, which was saying something considering he'd once been briefed by a general who communicated primarily through disappointed silences. The scholars sat in a semicircle, their luminescence ranging from deep violet to sharp silver, and regarded James with the collective expression of people about to conduct a very thorough vivisection of his intellect. The lead scholar, whose name translated to something like Keeper of Accumulated Wisdom, but who told James to call her Mestra, stood and activated a holographic display that made his eyes hurt just looking at it. Corporal Wright, your betrothal to Princess Lyson requires demonstration of intellectual capability sufficient to stand as consort to the heir of our empire. We will present you with a problem. You will solve it. The quality of your solution will determine whether you proceed to the next trial, or whether this betrothal is dissolved as incompatible. James looked at the holographic display. It showed what appeared to be multidimensional star charts overlaid with mathematical equations he'd need 3 doctorates to understand, all somehow connected to a philosophical text written in a language his translator was rendering as contemplative abstract concepts. He was so far out of his depth he couldn't even see the surface anymore. The problem, Mestra continued, concerns the optimization of resource distribution in a multi-system economy while maintaining cultural autonomy and accounting for relativistic time dilation, effects on political decision-making. You have 1 hour. James stared at the display, then at the scholars, then back at the display. I have a high school education and military training. I can field strip a rifle in 40 seconds and I know 17 ways to immobilize an opponent without permanent injury. I cannot solve that. The scholar's luminescence shifted, surprise, maybe, or disappointment. Mestra tilted her head. Then you concede. No. James stepped closer to the display, studying it despite understanding maybe 5% of what he was seeing. But I think you're testing the wrong thing. Explain. This problem assumes I need to be as smart as you are, but that's not what a consort does. The princess is already brilliant. You don't need me to match her intelligence. You need me to bring something different. He pointed at a section of the display showing cultural conflicts. You're treating every system as requiring the same optimization approach, but humans have a saying. If all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You're using Aurelian frameworks to solve Aurelian-defined problems. What if the problem itself is wrong? The room went very quiet. Mestra's luminescence shifted to an intrigued orange. Continue. James felt like he was defusing a bomb while blindfolded, but he pressed on. The princess told me she dreams of understanding other cultures, other perspectives. Maybe that's what a consort brings, not solutions but questions. Not matching her brilliance, but complementing it with a different way of seeing. He gestured at the philosophical text. I can't read this, but I can ask. Why does resource optimization matter more than people's happiness? Why does efficiency trump autonomy? Those aren't questions that need equations. They need conversation. The scholars conferred quietly, their luminescence flickering in patterns James couldn't interpret. Finally, Mestra smiled, actually smiled. The problem was unsolvable, deliberately so. We were not testing your ability to solve it. We were testing whether you would admit your limitations while defending your value regardless. You passed. James felt his knees go weak with relief. That's cruel. That's thorough. Mestra deactivated the display. The princess chose well. You may proceed to the social trial. The social trial turned out to be a formal banquet with approximately 80 Aurelian nobles, all of whom seemed to have very specific opinions about humans marrying into their royal line. James, coached extensively by Captain Torres and armed with note cards he'd hidden in his formal uniform, navigated conversations with the desperate focus of someone defusing that same bomb, but now it was also on fire. A duchess with ice-blue luminescence asked him pointed questions about human military capabilities that were obviously probing for intelligence. James deflected by asking about her work in agricultural reform, which turned out to be her actual passion, and spent 20 minutes learning about crop rotation in low-gravity environments, while she slowly decided he wasn't a complete disaster. A merchant lord tried to trap him in a conversation about trade tariffs, clearly expecting a soldier to know nothing about economics. James admitted his ignorance freely, then asked genuine questions about how interstellar commerce actually worked, and ended up with an impromptu education that the merchant lord seemed delighted to provide once he realized James was actually listening. Lord Cashin attended, sitting at the high table with an expression that suggested he was watching James and finding him wanting. Halfway through the banquet, he stood and made an announcement that silenced the room. I invoke the right of challenge. Corporal Wright seeks to stand beside our princess as consort. I would test whether he can stand at all. The room erupted in whispers. James looked at Princess Lyson, seated at the head table in her full ceremonial regalia. Her expression was unreadable, but her luminescence had gone cold silver, anger, he'd learned, or fear. Mestra, also attending as part of the council, stood from her seat. The challenge is acknowledged. Terms must be set. Ritual combat, Cashin said smoothly. Non-lethal but without restriction of force. The human claims worthiness to protect our princess. Let him demonstrate that capability. James felt his stomach drop. He'd known this was coming. Verum had warned him. But knowing and experiencing were very different things. Cashin was Aurelian, with all the physical advantages that implied. He was trained since childhood in their martial arts, and he was looking at James with the expression of someone about to break a toy he particularly despised. The combat trial was scheduled for the following day, which gave James exactly enough time to panic thoroughly. Captain Torres pulled him aside after the banquet. I've been reviewing Aurelian combat protocols, she said, pulling up footage on her datapad. The good news is they value honor and restraint. The bad news is Cashin is one of their finest warriors, and you're about to fight him in an arena that actively works against you. Define actively works against you. Torres showed him footage of previous ritual combats. The arena was a marvel of technology. Gravity could shift, terrain could change, environmental conditions could fluctuate. It was designed to test adaptability as much as skill. James watched an Aurelian warrior stumble as gravity doubled suddenly, then roll into a strike as it normalized. He watched terrain shift from smooth to obstacle-filled in seconds. I'm going to die, he said flatly. Probably not. Ritual combat has rules. First blood ends it usually. But Cashin could draw that out, embarrass you, make you look incompetent in front of the entire court. Torres shut off the datapad. Your best bet is to not try to win. Try to survive long enough to prove you won't quit. Inspiring pep talk, Captain. I'm not here to inspire, I'm here to keep you alive. She softened slightly. But for what it's worth, right, I think you've got more going for you than you realize. The princess sees something in you. The scholars saw it too. Maybe it's time you saw it in yourself. The arena was enormous, a circular space with walls that rose high enough that spectators could watch from multiple levels. James entered through a doorway that sealed behind him, wearing light armor that Tors had insisted he accept. Across the arena, Cassian entered with the confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The Arbiter, an ancient Aurelian whose luminescence had faded almost completely, announced the terms. Ritual combat until first blood or submission. Honor binds both participants. Dishonor results in forfeiture and exile. She looked at both combatants. Begin. Cassian moved like water, closing the distance between them faster than James could track. The first strike caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. The second swept his legs out from under him. James hit the ground hard, rolled instinctively, and came up just in time to block a strike that would have caught his head. The arena's gravity shifted. James stumbled. Cassian adapted seamlessly, using the change to increase his momentum. Another strike, this one to James's shoulder, sent pain lancing down his arm. The terrain shifted beneath them, smooth floor becoming broken rubble, forcing different footwork. James wasn't trying to win. He was trying to understand. Cassian was faster, stronger, better trained. But he was also fighting with patterns with trained responses. When the gravity shifted, he adapted one specific way. When terrain changed, he moved predictably. James took another hit, then another. His armor absorbed some of the impact, but not all. His vision was starting to blur. But he was learning, and learning meant opportunity. The gravity doubled suddenly. James dropped, using the increased weight to fuel a roll toward Cassian instead of away. He saw surprise flicker in the Lord's expression. Not much, just a momentary hesitation. James used it not to strike but to reposition, getting inside Cassian's longer reach. Terrain shifted again. James was ready this time, using the new obstacles to limit Cassian's movement advantage. He still couldn't win. But he could make Cassian work for it. He could prove he wouldn't stay down. They fought for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. James was bleeding from a cut above his eye. His ribs screamed with every breath, and his left arm was mostly useless. But he was still standing, still moving, still adapting. Cassian came in for what should have been a finishing strike. James, running on instinct and stubbornness, managed a defensive move that forced a stalemate. He couldn't advance, but Cassian couldn't complete his attack without violating the honor rules. They stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then two. Finally, Cassian stepped back, his luminescence flickering with something that might have been respect. "Sufficient," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet arena. "The human has demonstrated resilience." The Arbiter declared the combat concluded. James collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. The arena walls opened and Princess Lyson descended, moving faster than he'd ever seen her move. She knelt beside him, her hands already glowing with some kind of healing light he didn't understand. "You didn't have to keep standing," she said quietly, her luminescence soft with concern. "Yes, I did," James managed through split lips. "If I'm going to stand beside you, I have to prove I can actually stand." Her healing light was warm, mending the worst of his injuries with gentle efficiency. When she was finished, she helped him to his feet in front of the entire assembled court. "This is my choice," she announced, her voice carrying absolute authority, "and he has proven himself worthy of it." Later, in the garden where everything had started, James and Lyson walked slowly while his body remembered all the places Cassian had hit him. The three moons were rising again, casting their familiar triple shadows. "Cassian won't stop," Lyson said quietly. "He has too much pride, too much investment in opposing this betrothal. Then we deal with him, together." James took her hand, the gesture still feeling bold and terrifying and right. "You accepted my proposal. That makes this our fight, not just mine." Her luminescence flared brilliant gold, brighter than he'd ever seen it. And there, under 3 moons in a garden that had witnessed one accidental wish, Princess Lyson kissed him, brief, soft, and absolutely deliberate. "Together," she agreed, her voice holding promises that went beyond words. From a distant balcony, Lord Cashin watched them, his expression dark with calculation. The trials might be past, but he had other plans. The game was far from over. But in the garden, 2 people who had found each other through accident and chosen each other through determination stood together, and the moons shone on, bearing witness to something that was becoming far more than either had expected. The summons to the Emperor's War Council came 3 days after James's combat trial, delivered by a messenger whose luminescence was the diplomatic equivalent of "This is very serious, and you should be concerned." James, still sporting impressive bruises despite Lyson's healing abilities, dressed in his formal uniform, and tried not to think about all the ways this could end with him being launched out an airlock. The war room was circular, its walls displaying real-time star charts of the entire sector. The Emperor sat at the head of a crescent table, his presence commanding despite his relatively simple robes. His luminescence was a deep, steady blue, the color of someone who'd ruled for centuries and wasn't impressed by much. Around the table sat the senior council members, military commanders, and, unfortunately, Lord Cashin. Princess Lyson was there too, dressed in her official regalia, every inch the crown princess. She met James's eyes briefly, and her luminescence flickered with reassurance. Captain Torres was there as well, representing Earth's military interests, and she gave James a subtle nod that translated roughly to "Don't say anything stupid." The Emperor gestured James to a seat. "Corporal Wright, you have proven yourself adequately in the trials set before you. Now we must discuss matters of substance." He activated a section of the star chart. "A border dispute with the Ketharin Collective has escalated. They contest our mining rights in the outer reach systems. Negotiations have stalled. This could mean war." James stayed quiet, unsure why he was hearing this. He was a soldier, not a diplomat. Lord Cashin stood, his luminescence sharp with calculation. "Your Majesty, I propose that the princess lead a diplomatic delegation to the border systems. She has studied Ketharin culture extensively. Her presence would demonstrate our commitment to peaceful resolution." The room went silent. Princess Lyson's luminescence flickered cold. She saw the trap immediately. A diplomatic mission to contested systems was dangerous, high-visibility work. Success would prove her capability as heir. Failure or injury or worse would throw succession into chaos. "I accept," Lyson said, her voice cutting through the silence before anyone could object. "I will lead the delegation." Cashin's luminescence brightened with satisfaction. "Of course, Your Highness. I recommend a purely Aurelian contingent." "I'm going with her," James said, the words out before his brain could stop them. Every eye in the room turned to him. Tor's expression suggested she was reconsidering her career choices. The Emperor's luminescence shifted to interested orange. "Corporal Wright," Cashin said smoothly, "you have no diplomatic credentials, no military rank in our forces, no experience with—" "He has my trust," Princess Lyson interrupted, her voice carrying absolute authority. "That is credential enough." The Emperor leaned back in his seat, his ancient eyes studying James with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, human, why should I allow my only daughter, my heir, to bring you on a potentially dangerous diplomatic mission? What can you offer that my trained diplomats and warriors cannot?" This was it, the real test. Not physical prowess or intellectual capability or social grace, but the fundamental question of worth. James could give a safe answer, something about Earth-Aurelian cooperation. He could be diplomatic, careful, measured. But Lyson had accepted his proposal because he was honest, and honesty was all he really had. "Nothing, Your Majesty." James met the Emperor's gaze directly. "I can't offer anything your trained people don't have better. I'm not smarter than your scholars, not stronger than your warriors, not more diplomatic than your ambassadors. I'm just a soldier who accidentally proposed to your daughter because I whispered a wish I didn't think anyone would hear." The room was absolutely silent. James pressed on. "But I can offer her something she told me she's never had. Someone who sees Lyson before they see the princess. Someone who wants her to succeed because she matters, not because I gain something from it. Someone who will stand beside her not because it's politically advantageous, but because I can't imagine standing anywhere else." He turned to Lyson, finding her luminescence bright with emotion. "I don't know if that's enough, but it's honest, and it's all I've got. If it's not sufficient, then I'll step aside because her success matters more than my feelings. But if there's any chance I can help her, even a little, then I have to try." The silence stretched. Then the Emperor did something James's cultural briefings had not prepared him for. He laughed. Deep, genuine laughter that seemed to surprise even the ancient ruler himself. "You are either the bravest human I have encountered or the most foolish, likely both." The Emperor stood. "The mission will proceed. Princess Lyson will lead. Corporal Wright will accompany her with full consort privileges and protections." His gaze turned cold as it found Cassian. "And Lord Cassian, your objections are noted, dismissed, and if you attempt to undermine this mission in any way, you will find my patience has limits." Cassian's luminescence flickered with barely controlled fury, but he bowed in acceptance. The diplomatic mission launched 2 days later on a sleek Aurelian cruiser that made human ships look like antiques. The delegation included scholars, warriors, and enough protocol officers to staff a small embassy. James mostly tried to stay out of the way and not accidentally start any more incidents. The Catherine Collective turned out to be insectoid, with complicated hierarchical structures and communication that relied heavily on pheromones James's translator struggled to interpret. The negotiations were tense, with both sides dug into positions that seemed irreconcilable. Then Lyson did something her advisors called inadvisable and James called brilliant. She asked the Catherine representatives about their concerns rather than just negotiating positions. It turned out the mining dispute was really about ancestral territories being violated, a cultural concern that had gotten lost in legal arguments about resource rights. James, listening from his position as unofficial consort, noticed something the Aurelian diplomats were missing. He leaned close to Lyson and whispered, "They're treating this like your people are family who forgot important traditions. They're not angry, they're hurt." Lyson's luminescence brightened with understanding. She shifted the entire negotiation framework, acknowledging the cultural violation and proposing a solution that honored Catherine traditions while still allowing resource access. It wasn't perfect, but it was something both sides could accept without losing face. The mission succeeded. They returned to Aurelia with an agreement that shocked the pessimists and delighted the optimists. The Emperor himself met them at the palace, and for the first time since James had arrived, he smiled at the human soldier who'd accidentally become part of his family. "Perhaps," the Emperor said quietly to James, "honest wishes are worth more than careful plans." The formal wedding ceremony was scheduled for the following week. James spent most of that time in a panic, learning dances he'd never heard of, and trying to pronounce vows in a language his tongue wasn't designed for. His mother arrived via transport, crying happy tears before she even cleared customs. His father spent most of his time asking Aurelian engineers technical questions about their ships until tours had to physically separate them. The ceremony took place in the garden, under 3 moons, exactly where everything had started. Bioluminescent flowers had been cultivated to bloom in patterns that represented both Aurelian and Earth traditions, a compromise that satisfied no purist but delighted everyone else. James wore robes that were somehow both Aurelian formal and militarily acceptable. Lyson wore something that looked woven from moonlight itself, her luminescence bright with joy. When they exchanged vows, his in halting Aurelian, hers in perfect English. The garden's flowers bloomed brighter in response, a phenomenon the attending priests declared divinely auspicious. Lord Cashin attended because protocol demanded it, but he left early, his opposition finally exhausted. Some battles, even proud nobles knew when they were lost. Afterward, while the reception continued and cultures mingled in ways that would have seemed impossible months ago, James and Lyson stood together in the quiet corner of the garden where he'd made his catastrophic wish. "Do you regret it?" Lyson asked softly, that whisper that changed everything. James thought about the trials, the challenges, the political nightmares. He thought about being thrown into a life he never planned for, bonded to someone he barely knew, caught between two civilizations with competing interests. Then he looked at his wife that would take a lifetime to feel real, and her brilliant mind and lonely heart and luminescent joy. "Only that I didn't say it louder," he replied. She laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. Her luminescence flared brilliant gold, and the garden responded, flowers blooming in cascading waves of light. Above them, 3 moons traced their eternal paths. James leaned close and whispered something else, much softer this time, careful not to accidentally trigger any more life-altering oaths. Lyson's ears twitched with amusement. "I wish for that too," she whispered back in English, her accent perfect. And the moons shone on, bearing witness to a love built on accident.